And so it's my great pleasure to introduce Greg Jones, who is the senior pastor at Westminster Presbyterian Church in Wilmington, Delaware. And he will be presenting our program this evening on white Christian nationalism.
Right, thank you very much, Sue, and thanks to the Peace and Justice Work Group for sponsoring the variety of topics that come up every Thursday night. You really do a terrific job. This Thursday night is on white Christian nationalism. It's not a particularly fun topic, it's pretty serious. So I hope you can stick with me, but I really appreciate all of you joining with me tonight. I assume that everybody here probably knows something about white Christian nationalism. Some of you, I'm sure, know a lot more than others. I would like to start by sharing a working definition of Christian nationalism. So Sue, if you could put that up for everybody. You see it there. Christian nationalism is a political ideology that believes that laws and guiding principles of one's country should be based on a particular view of Christianity, and that Christians should then receive special status. Now, you'll see in the definition there that I say one's country because the United States is not the only place that Christian nationalism exists. One example is Patriarch Kirill of the Russian Orthodox Church. Rather than evaluating Russian political decisions by looking at the teachings of Jesus, he interprets the Christian faith through the lens of the Russian state. Patriarch Kirill called Vladimir Putin's rule a miracle from God, and he justified the slaughter of innocent civilians in Ukraine as an apocalyptic war against Western immorality. Okay, so you can pull that down. Thank you. Of course, the Patriarch of Russia is not the only one. It's also Viktor Orban of Hungary. He's another Christian nationalist. Also Bolsonaro in Brazil, in Kony and Uganda. So with that caveat that Christian nationalism can exist in any country, I'll focus my attention on white Christian nationalism in the United States. In our country, Christian nationalists insist that the United States was established as an explicitly Christian nation. And they believe that this close relationship between Christianity in the state needs to score a finer point on it. For the most part today, white Christian nationalists believe that white, straight, evangelical Christians should run the country. Many are cynical about human rights, and most oppose immigration. White Christian nationalists believe that many of their views are under attack. They feel that they must take their country back. Thus, they lean toward authoritarian figures who promise to impose their evangelical Christian views on everyone else. Now, white Christian nationalism has been around for a long time. It's been actually around for centuries. In the early days of our country, it was really white Anglo-Protestant nationalism. In the 1600s, Roman Catholics were banned from some of the colonies. Some Quakers were hanged. In New York, Catholics were banned from holding public office until the early 1800s. Catholics did have civil rights in Maryland, but Jews did not. The movement went kind of below the radar, to the fringe for many years. But since the 1970s, I think we've seen it really gaining momentum again in our country. It finally began making the front page news after the mob of Trump supporters stormed the US Capitol on January 6th in an attempt to stop the certification of Joe Biden as president. Many of the insurrectionists were not simply conservative Republicans. They were evangelical Christians. Some of them waved Christian flags. Some held up banners that said, "Jesus saves." Many carried crosses with them. Some prayed after they broke into the Capitol. Some of those who attacked the Capitol claimed to have a mandate, not only from Donald Trump, but a mandate from God to do what they were doing. Sue, let's show the next slide. I want us to make a clear distinction between patriotism and nationalism. They're similar, but they're not the same. I think it's important to make this distinction. Patriotism, as you see, is a love of country. Patriots love and support their country, and they work to improve it. Nationalism is really a harder term to nail down. It's how one defines his or her country in terms of language, culture, and history. Christian nationalism is the belief that the American nation is defined by Christianity and that the government should take active steps to keep it that way. Some white Christian nationalists have advocated for an amendment to the Constitution to recognize America's Christian heritage. Others want to reinstate prayer in public schools. Some work to enshrine a Christian nationalist interpretation of American history in school curricula, including that America has a special relationship with God or has been chosen by God to carry out a special mission on earth. Many advocate for immigration restrictions, specifically to prevent a change to American religious and ethnic demographics. All right, Sue, we can pull it down. In recent years, the movement has grown increasingly characterized by fear and by a belief that Christians are victims of persecution. Some are beginning to argue that American Christians need to prepare to fight, physically actually, to preserve America's identity, an argument that played very well into the January 6th riot. In an opinion piece just this morning in the Washington Post, Michael Gerson writes that what we hear from many white Christian nationalists is, "This Christian country is mine, you are defiling it, and I will take it back by any means necessary." Many of you know that Doug Mastriano is the Republican candidate for governor in Pennsylvania. He promotes Christian nationalism and is an election conspiracy theorist. He actually led the effort to challenge Donald Trump's defeat in Pennsylvania. At an event called Patriots Arise, a Christian nationalist conference organized by QAnon, Mastriano told the crowd, "In November, we're going to take our state back. Our God will make it so." You probably know that Marjorie Taylor Greene calls herself a Christian nationalist. On her website, for a mere $30, you can buy a t-shirt that says "Proud Christian Nationalist." There's an organization called Christians Against Christian Nationalism. Some of you may have heard of that. They have a statement which I think is really quite good. I've signed it along with many others. And Sue, if you can put that statement up on the screen. I'm sorry, it's a bit long, but it's really well written, and I'd like to read it. As Christians, our faith teaches us that everyone is created in God's image and commands us to love one another. As Americans, we value our system of government and the good that can be accomplished in our constitutional democracy. Today, we are concerned about a persistent threat to both our religious communities and our democracy. Christian nationalism. Christian nationalism seeks to merge Christian and American identities, distorting both the Christian faith and America's constitutional democracy. Christian nationalism demands Christianity be privileged by the state and implies that to be a good American, one must be a Christian. It often overlaps with and provides cover for white supremacy and racial subjugation. We reject this damaging political ideology and invite our Christian brothers and sisters to join us in opposing this threat to our faith and to our nation. As Christians, we are bound to Christ, not by citizenship, but by faith. We believe that people of all faiths and none have the right and responsibility to engage constructively in the public square. Patriotism does not require us to minimize our religious convictions. One's religious affiliation or lack thereof should be irrelevant to one's standing in the civic community. Government should not prefer one religion over another or religion over non-religion. Religious instruction is best left to our houses of worship, other religious institutions, and to our families. America's historic commitment to religious pluralism enables faith communities to live in civic harmony with one another without sacrificing our theological convictions. Conflating religious authority with political authority is idolatrous and often leads to oppression of minority and other marginalized groups, as well as the spiritual impoverishment of religion itself. We must stand up to and speak out against Christian nationalism, especially when it inspires acts of violence and intimidation, including vandalism, bomb threats, arson, hate crimes, and attacks on houses of worship against religious communities at home and abroad. Whether we worship at a church, mosque, synagogue, or temple, America has no second-class faiths. All are equal under the U.S. Constitution. As Christians, we must speak in one voice, condemning Christian nationalism as a distortion of the gospel of Jesus and a threat to American democracy. And you probably can't read it in that tiny writing there at the bottom, but if you would like to find that statement or even sign on, it's just www.christiansagainstchristiannationalism.org. You can easily Google that and find it. Thank you. So sorry to read that long document, but I thought it was very well written and really got to a lot of the core of what Christian nationalism is about. Here's a pop quiz. We might have to unmute for this one, or people can raise their hand if they know the answer. What three-letter word is not in the Constitution? Who wants to take a shot at it? Sally?
Sin?
Not sure. Probably isn't.
God.
God.
Yeah,
That's the word.
that is it. You're right.
Yeah.
I
Neither is gun, by the way, but I suspect all of us can remember that Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville back in 2017. Hundreds of white nationalists descended on Charlottesville because a statue of Robert E. Lee was going to be removed from a park there. And, there just came mass chaos for several days. The white Christian nationalists, you may remember, marched through the streets and shouted anti-Semitic slurs. Eventually, one of the protesters drove his car into a crowd of counter-protesters, killing one woman and injuring several others. I want to turn to something that some of you know, a conservative columnist named David French. He's an attorney. He's a political commentator. He was a fellow at the National Review Institute for some time. He currently serves as senior editor of The Dispatch, which is a conservative online magazine. He wrote an excellent article, I thought, on Christian nationalism, several pages long, and I'm going to pull out some of his key points for you. French says 3 things are true at once. First, the United States is the most Christian advanced democracy in the world, even with declining rates of religious belief and declining church attendance. He points to Pew Research polls that a solid majority of 65% of Americans identify themselves as Christians. Second, both the Republican and Democratic parties are dependent on the Christians in their party for their electoral success. Non-white Democrats, and especially Black Democrats, are among the most church-going members of American society. At the same time, the Republican Party would be irrelevant today without its own white evangelical base. So the bottom line is that Christians in both parties have absolute veto party over, at the least, the party's national candidates, and in most states, it extends to all the statewide candidates as well. And third, French says American political culture is just what we know it is: toxic, hyper-partisan, corrupt, and increasingly a violent mess. Given those first 2 factors, that 2/3 of the country are Christian, and they make up a large percentage of both political parties, this shouldn't be. After all, Jesus could not have been more clear. In John 13, he declared, "By this, everyone will know you, that you are my disciples, if you love one another." But we all know we are living in very volatile times. There seems to be more anger, more mean-spiritedness, more distrust than there has been in many years. The Pew Research Center has polled Republicans and Democrats about their views of people in the opposite party. Each side says that members of the other party are more immoral, dishonest, and close-minded than other Americans. This mutual loathing of people in the other party comes from a great number of Christians, a great number of people who claim to be Christians. Many say that civility and decency are no longer adequate for our time. One of the core arguments of the new right is, we tried decency, it didn't work, now's the time to punch back. French argues that Christian virtues such as love, peace, patience, and gentleness have become secondary values. When push comes to shove, it's our vision of justice that matters. And by justice, what he means is that what we think is the right position on a social issue. Of course, what conservatives think is correct is very different than what progressives think is correct. They're just not the same thing. That's why many Republican candidates for office can count on evangelicals to support them, even though these candidates spread election lies. As long as they support Donald Trump, lying is tolerable, becomes a secondary value. The Reverend Tim Keller, some of you may have heard of him. He's a sort of a conservative Presbyterian minister in New York City, very large church. He points out that biblical justice is characterized by radical generosity, universal equality, life-changing advocacy for the poor, and corporate and individual responsibility. Now, to white Christian nationalists, I'm sure he sounds like a flaming liberal, but he's not. Scripture anticipates that Christians will face evil. Yet the command is clear. See to it that no one repays evil for evil, but always pursue what's good for one another and for all. It's in both Romans 12 and first letter of Peter. Back to David French, he says, Christian young people are often taught that they should be countercultural. The youth group version of that admonition goes something like this. When the world is profane, your speech is clean. When the world is drunk, you are sober. When the world is promiscuous, you are chaste. How do you know we're Christian? We don't cuss, drink, or have premarital sex. But the call to counterculture is much more comprehensive than that. When the world is greedy, you are generous. When the world is cruel, you are kind. When the world is fearful, you are faithful. When the world is proud, you are humble. How do you know we're Christian? By our love. We think we know what's just, and we think we can't do justice without power. So we decide we can't let kindness or humility stand in the way of justice. As a result, our advanced nation, where the majority claim to be Christian, is tearing itself apart, and its millions of believers bear much of the blame. Now, I believe followers of Jesus should work on spreading the kingdom of God on earth. Any of you who sit through my sermons know that's a constant thing. That is, creating communities that are based on love toward our neighbors and justice for all. White evangelicals seem to have confused the kingdom of God with a white Christian America ruled by authoritarian leaders who will enforce their version of values. Following the teachings of Jesus will not always clarify one's opinion on a particular issue. However, you must take a long, hard look at whatever your opinion is, especially if it's diametrically opposed to Christian values. White Christian nationalism is a political movement that drapes itself in a distorted view of Christianity. At its core is the notion that the United States is a nation created by and for Christians. While that may at first glance have some appeal to those of us who follow Christ, it opens the door to discriminating against millions: Jews, Muslims, Asians, people of other faiths, people of no faith. As a follower of Jesus, I want his teachings to influence the laws of our country. I believe that would help us to build a more perfect union. However, discrimination is not a Christian principle. Another key component of white Christian nationalism is how we understand the word freedom. The word has become a misguided rallying cry for those who seek a libertarian view of freedom. Such a view disregards the fact that in a large pluralistic society, individual freedom is limited to the extent that it infringes on the freedom of others. Some of those who yell freedom also want books banned from the libraries. In her new book, entitled On Freedom, author Maggie Nelson puts the issue succinctly. She says that she takes it as a given that our entire existence, including our freedom and unfreedom, is built upon a we instead of an I. What kind of nation do we want? Do we envision a country where everyone is treated equally? Or do we see a nation where white and male and heterosexual are given privileges over those who have not scored that trifecta? White Christian nationalists not only fear that their values are under attack, but that other groups have corrupted our country and are trying to take it away from them. And those who are trying to take it away are non-white, non-Christian, and non-heterosexual. White Christian nationalists want to return to a time when the nation was ruled by white straight men, and those who did not fit into those categories, when people that didn't fit into those categories understood their proper place. So why would I, a white straight Christian man who's benefited from my status, speak against white Christian nationalism? Because first and foremost, I'm a follower of Jesus. And I try to follow principles found in such biblical passages as follows. Sue, could you put up the passages I'd like to share with them? For me, these are some of the core passages of scripture that guide us in the way we are to live. Genesis 1, you all know this. God created humans in God's image. In the image of God, he created them, male and female, God created them. Luke 6, do to others as you would have them do to you. We all know the golden rule. It actually appears in every major religion in the world. Mark 12, you shall love your neighbor as yourself. Matthew 25, I was hungry and you gave me food. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you welcomed me. I was naked and you gave me clothing. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. Micah 6:8. What does the Lord require of us but to do justice, to love kindness, and to walk humbly with God? And Matthew 5:9. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Okay, so you can take those down. We are to create a nation based not on principles of prejudice, privilege, exclusion, separation, and blind loyalty to political leaders, but rather on the principles of compassion, justice, equality, liberty, and peace. Thank you. I'll be glad to open it up for any kind of questions, comments, discussion. Sue?
Thank you so much, Greg. If you have a question or a comment, I would ask that you go down to the reaction button at the bottom of your screen. And if you click on that, one of the options is raise hand. And if you raise your hand, it will move you to the upper left of everybody's screen. And I can call on you as you appear. So it looks like Marge Johnson has a question or a comment. Marge, can you unmute yourself? If you'd like to turn on your camera, that would be great so that we can actually see people's faces as they're talking. Thank you.
Hi, Marge.
Hi, Greg. Thanks so much for this program tonight. So my question and my disappointment is I'm so happy to hear what you had to say tonight, but I am so disappointed in all, not just the Presbyterian Church, but the whole Christian community in their lack of response to Christian nationalism. And I'm equally disappointed with the media in how they portray all Christians as Christian nationalists or evangelicals. And it's a huge problem. And I don't know how we get entities to begin to speak out and make their voice heard like you have done tonight?
Right. Let me make a couple of comments. One is that I think it's really incumbent on pastors in their individual congregations to make clear where they stand on this issue. So, I encourage all of them to do that. As far as the national media, I think we're seeing a change. I have been frustrated to no end for years about how the media would tend to use just this blanket term Christian to represent all kinds of craziness. And oftentimes they were slamming these fundamentalist Christians, but portraying us all in that light. I've had people actually tell me that they had thought that most Christians were just all anti-gay, hated gays, that they're all narrow-minded, that they're all hypocrites, that the pastors are all probably abusing children. It's just this picture that was painted out there, and I think that's what you're alluding to, Marge. But I do think we've maybe turned a corner. I've started noticing more and more articles that rather than saying just Christian in them, they first started talking about evangelical Christians, and now they very oftentimes are talking about Christian nationalism. But yeah, we need to do a better job of educating the media on the great varieties that there are among Christians. Others? Rob.
Yeah, great presentation, very informative. Thank you. I read an article, I'm trying to think it was in the Atlantic or somewhere not too long ago, that talked about a number of evangelical churches where their pastors are being forced to leave because there's, kind of like folks are infiltrating school boards and whatnot. They're having a sizable enough presence in the governing body of a church to be disruptive. And these evangelical pastors are finding themselves, not quote unquote conservative enough or not in line with Christian nationalism. So it's yet another opportunity to look across the aisle and differentiate. And I don't know, while theologically we might be very different than our evangelical brothers and sisters, but they too are not monolithic, right? And so how do we not fall into that same trap and sort of paint them with one brush, I guess?
Yeah, I think that's a great point, Rob. Yeah, I read about an evangelical pastor in Tennessee who had actually grown up in that town and had become been the pastor there for more than a dozen years. And just over the last few years, with the swing in his congregation of people who are becoming more and more narrow-minded and not wanting to hear him talk about what the opposite side might even be thinking, he was forced to leave, and he's now an associate pastor at a church out in California, even though he and his wife had always wanted to stay in this community in Tennessee. Yeah. There's a lot of pressure on pastors right now, in particular, as politics becomes more of a us versus them kind of environment. And I'm very grateful to be at Westminster, where people know that I'm going to present what I believe to be the best biblical representation of what's going on that I can, but knowing that I may fail at times, and they're forgiving. They know that they can disagree with what I say sometimes, but still respect me and want me to continue. So I'm very fortunate. Others?
I have several members of my family who fall into the evangelical Christian column. One nephew in particular, whose life is wrapped around Jesus. He posts on Facebook daily. He had a terrible life experience when his father and his brother died of COVID, being not vaccinated. And it is his view that this was Jesus' plan. And that Jesus' plan was to make him a voice for faith. But I've tried to have conversations with him about separating children from their parents at the border, about any number of topics that Jesus spoke about. And the thread of judgment and superiority is stunning. And I have been resoundingly unsuccessful at bringing forth the words that Jesus said in a way that would reshape or even touch his views. It's an unbelievable challenge. And I mean, he's a wonderful person and a faithful person, but my goodness, his view of what it is to be a follower of Christ is and there's no window, there's no crack, there's no leverage. I don't know what to do or say.
Yeah, I think you have to accept the fact that you're not going to convert him. You're not going to change him. But we can be kind in the way we disagree with others. And the hope is always that we plant small seeds that one day might come to fruition.
I'll keep that in mind. Thank you. Let's see, Rob.
I was just going to comment in the same vein that it doesn't matter. You can talk until you're blue in the face and you're not going to change their minds. I find it interesting that the understanding or the precepts that white Christian nationalists follow or believe are really the same as people who are conservative in their political leanings, but never crack the Bible open, never attend church, are not spiritual even. I find it ironic that those people would still probably be acceptable to the white Christian nationalists, even though they might say they're Christians, but they don't practice it. And that was just an observation I thought I would give. Thank you.
Thank you for your comments, Rob. Yeah, unfortunately, many families have divisions within them. It's difficult. It's difficult. I saw another hand.
Yeah, there was another. Disappeared.
Maybe it was a similar comment. Yeah. There we
Sheridan.
go, Sheridan.
Yes, I was saying that, Reverend Jones, thank you for your presentation. But I feel that there's been a history of religious violence in the world. I mean, for going back centuries, and we just haven't really experienced it on this, on this continent or in this country. And I think it's going to happen. I really do feel that the country is ripe for this violence, and it's going to be horrible. And I agree with Marge, who said she was disappointed in a lot of the mainline churches that really weren't, and the media weren't really, given the clarion call about this. I think a lot of pastors are afraid, like the pastor who was run out of his church. We've seen librarians being run out of their jobs for books. I mean, this is. I think it's worse than we think it is, or either worse than we want to believe it is. But I think we're going to see a lot of violence, a lot of malicious violence, and it's going to be something new for our country, at least in the last several decades.
Sheridan, I worry like you do. I hope and pray you're wrong. I hope that this is a true minority, but there are over 300,000 guns out there in this country. And so if violence erupts, there are plenty of, I said 300,000, it's 300 million, I'm sorry.
Million.
Yeah. So the potential is there. I still don't know how many people are really ready to take up arms. I certainly hope they can be dissuaded from doing that. That would completely destroy our country. But people are saying that they think another civil war is potential.
I'm reminded of a column that Mike Royko, shows you how old I am, a column that Mike Royko wrote in the Chicago Tribune quite a number of years ago. And it was an open letter to God. And it talked about God's love for every human being. And it was not a Christian view per se. It pretty much straddled the major religions in terms of concept. And yet he said, but God, Northern Ireland, Israel and Palestine, and it was triggered by, and now someone just shot the Pope. And so I think, to Sheridan's point, kind of if you look across the globe, religious infused fueled violence has been, well, you have the Crusades, it's endemic in our history. And so perhaps it's naive of us to think that it wouldn't happen here. And yet you would think after centuries that we somehow would have learned something, that we could have come to some other way, some other view, some other actions.
Well, one piece of that does give me a little hope is that if we go back just 40 or 50 years, most Christian denominations were pretty exclusive about the fact that they thought Jesus was the only way to go, and they could be more intolerant. I do think that there's more tolerance among religious faiths than there used to be. I know that we've opened up a lot of dialogues and done mission projects together with Jews and Muslims in our community, and that wasn't done earlier. So I see some hopeful signs as well. Dee Dee?
I'm wondering about the educational institutions that train ministers and the leadership there and what you know about them.
So I do not know what's going on in seminaries today, but I assume anything I've read would lead me to believe that at least in Presbyterian seminaries, there's much more awareness of interfaith connections. A few decades ago, it was how well can Presbyterians talk to Roman Catholics and Lutherans, but now we need to sit down and talk together with Muslims and Buddhists and people of other faiths. So it certainly seems to me that it's moved in the right direction.
But I guess I also, are there very conservative seminaries?
You bet.
That are teaching this next generation the ideology that you were speaking to?
Yeah, I would guess probably so. There are seminaries across the spectrum, but I do know that I've read a couple of places where it comes from a evangelical professor, and you would think they would maybe toe the line more on white nationalism, and they're very clear. They know what the Bible says, and they talk about justice and peace and compassion and generosity. So I don't know. Yeah, Lyle may have a comment about this.
Yes.
Does
Yes.
anyone ever discuss empathy in these Christian colleges? Do they ever say that you should look at the other person on a one-on-one basis?
Absolutely. A core teaching is that everyone is a child of God and bears the image of God, and that we're to love one another as brothers and sisters. That's core.
Yeah, I wanted to, are you, are you acknowledging my wee hand?
I am.
Okay, good. I wanted to share with this wonderfully gathered group that seminary in which I'm a graduate, and I'm proud of it. It's Union Theological in New York City, has developed in the last 10 years a curriculum that anybody that goes through the seminary and wants to become a minister has to take this course. And because they're in New York City, there's diversity. There's Muslims, there's Jews, there's Hindus and Buddhists. And this curriculum demands that you go get acquainted with these people. You learn their practices. You understand how their religious faith speaks to them, equips them for living, does what you said, Greg, live that golden rule, which every major religion on the face of the earth communicates that. It's our failure to live it that causes us the problems that you so well articulated at the beginning of in your presentation. And I take hope in that. And I take hope in the comments that you said a few minutes ago, which I pick up also in the Christian Century. It's a magazine that reflects the diversity of religious faith in America. It's called Christian Century. It is now a century old, and but it is not to be confused with white Christian nationalism at all. It is 180 degrees opposite of that in the kinds of articles, and it's very much what us in Presbyterian world call mainstream Protestantism. So that's my comment, and I thank you very much for making this presentation. And I wish there were 38 people, 37. I'm here with my wife and a neighbor who is passionate about this issue. So you can add 2 more people to whatever your number is if you are interested in that. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Lyle. Yeah, one of the things that several of our members have commented about was over the past few years prior to the pandemic, we had some iftars with some members of the Muslim community, some that we had at Westminster and some where we went to their place. And one of the great awakenings was that, for people on both sides, was that, wow, we people of faith have more in common than we realized. And we began to really relish that and feel more like brothers and sisters because of that shared understanding that we have. Very hopeful for me.
I grew up in Westminster Church, and I was a member of fellowship back in the day. And at the time, we went and visited other houses of worship. As a confirmation class, we went to synagogues and went to a bar mitzvah and went to Catholic masses and went to a mosque, actually, which was quite unusual at the time, and always had an opportunity to sit and talk with the other people whose house of worship it was. And I think being able to expose children earlier to other faiths and to be able to see that connection, that connectivity, is a really valuable lesson to implant early.
Yeah, all the religions focus on kindness and compassion and justice and peace. And so we see those commonalities. I see Casey's hands up. Casey?
Thanks, Greg. You touched on this to some extent, but I wonder to what degree the fact that there is this sort of confluence of events now where political leadership is stoking these ideas of white Christian nationalism, often political leaders who are not Christians at all. This started about the time of Ronald Reagan, who was parading as a super Christian. And we're in a circumstance where I think Donald Trump makes no pretense of being a person of faith. And yet they are masking as Christians, or rather co-opting these notions that the evangelicals have that puts us in a circumstance that's really quite different from something we've experienced before, where there is a combination of political leadership that is leading ostensibly a Christian movement as opposed to pastors and people who are trained faith leaders. And I wonder whether that circumstance contributes to the intensity of the problem we have just now.
Oh, I think it definitely intensifies the problem. What's frustrating for people like me is the fact that the real reason they want the person's, the real reason the people support the leader is because they like their position on immigration, or they think that Blacks in this country are getting a little too much power. They don't have anything to do with the basic core values of Christianity, as we've mentioned: compassion, kindness, humility, generosity, peace, etc.
Well, I would like to thank you all for being here this evening. I know of a number of people you may as well who would hope to be here, but for one reason or another could not. So as I said, the link to the Westminster YouTube channel is in the chat, and you can find it on our website. I would also invite those of you in the Wilmington area to join us on the first Friday Walk for Justice and Peace. We will start at 719 North Shipley Street, the parking lot of the Episcopal Church of Saints Andrew and Matthew, and walk in silence down to Rodney Square. It's the first Friday of every month. Many of us here have participated in those walks in the past, so we hope to see you. And next week, we will have a speaker, two speakers, Charlie McDowell, who is a member of Westminster and is chair of the board of what is known as the work group, the WRK group. It is Reach Riverside, the Warehouse, and the Kingswood Community Center in Wilmington, a purpose-built community that Charlie has been the guiding light from the beginning. And they recently opened Imani Village, which is the first new housing area in Reach Riverside. And also speaking will be Logan Herring. If you have ever heard Logan speak, he's mesmerizing. He was named, I believe, one of the most influential Delawareans and the large nonprofit leader of the year in 2021. He has given in-person classes at Westminster in the past, and it should be a marvelous program that offers hope and a path to healing and education and health in a very difficult portion of Wilmington. So we hope that you'll join us. And if you're interested in future classes, as I said, please put your name and your email address in the chat, and we will advise you of programs as they come up in the future. And I'll turn it over to Greg for a closing word.
The only thing I was going to say is that you really want to tune in to this next presentation. Imani Village is incredibly inspiring. Amazing things have been happening in our community, and you will really be inspired by it. We and some others were at the dedication just recently as they started into these beautiful new homes for so many people. It's just a huge change in our community. So I hope you will tune in next week. And Sue, I can't remember if you mentioned that tomorrow's walk is at 5:30 at Sam.
Oh, thank you.
We meet.
I did not. Come a few minutes early. We have electric candles you may wish to carry. As I said, we walk in silence, open and close with prayer. So come a little bit early. We start walking at 5:30 and we end at 6. It's also a wonderful opportunity for fellowship at restaurants or whatever in the Wilmington area. So hope to see you all there. Thanks so much for being here tonight.
Thanks everybody for tuning in and sticking with it for me tonight. I really appreciate your presence. Thank you.
Good night.